All right, let's kick off our deep dive. And we're looking at civil-military relations this time.
Yep.
And, we always try to pick like a good foundational text to kind of ground our conversation. And you went with Samuel Huntington's The Soldier in the State.
Yeah.
So you've got, I see excerpts from the book itself, your own notes, and it looks like you've pulled some interesting images too.
Yeah, it's The Soldier in the State. It's a classic.
Yeah.
Um and it's interesting because it was written way back in 1957,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
but it still has a lot to say about the relationship between military power and civilian authority,
Okay.
which is really what we mean when we talk about civil-military relations.
So this isn't just some theoretical debate for academics to like argue about in their ivory towers, right?
No, not at all.
This relationship, like
Yeah.
it actually has real implications for all of us,
Oh, absolutely.
even if we're not, serving in the military or working in government.
Absolutely. Civil-military relations, they impact everything. It's everything from national security to how decisions about war and peace are made.
Right.
It even influences a society's values and how power is distributed.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So going through your notes, it seems like Huntington had some pretty strong opinions about how this relationship should work, like the ideal scenario.
Yeah, he did.
He makes this distinction between objective civilian control and subjective civilian control of the military.
Okay.
Can you unpack those terms for us a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So imagine like objective control
Yeah.
as creating a clear separation
Okay.
between the military and politics.
Yes.
The focus there is on military professionalism. So developing expertise,
Yeah.
maintaining a distinct military culture, and making sure that the military is focused on its primary function,
Okay, so
which is defense.
everyone's kind of staying in their lane.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
You want a highly trained and effective military, but one that's firmly under civilian oversight.
Okay.
Subjective control, on the other hand, is more about maximizing civilian power over the military. And that can sometimes lead to politicization,
Okay.
which can have some negative consequences.
Interesting. Interesting. You've also got this image here of the Roman army.
Yeah.
How does that connect to these different types of control?
Well, I think the Roman army is a fascinating case study.
Okay.
On one hand, it was incredibly powerful.
Right.
It played a key role in expanding and securing the empire.
Yeah.
But that very power also made it a potential threat to internal stability, especially when emperors were weak
Okay.
or there was political turmoil.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword. You need a strong military to protect you from external threats,
Right.
but it also creates this internal risk.
Exactly. Exactly.
So the emperors were always walking this tightrope,
Yeah.
trying to keep the army strong, but also under control.
Right. And that tension between military power and civilian authority, it's something that all societies have to grapple with, even today. And in your notes, you highlighted some modern examples where countries are struggling to maintain that objective control.
Right, right. Yeah, and it's unsettling to see instances where there's political interference in military appointments,
Yeah.
or when the military is being used for domestic political purposes.
Right.
It feels like a slippery slope.
It can be. It definitely can be. And those kinds of actions, they can undermine military professionalism,
Yeah.
erode public trust in the military, and ultimately weaken national security. But, of course, there are also plenty of examples of countries that are doing a good job
Okay.
of maintaining that balance, where civilian leaders respect military expertise,
Right.
but also hold the military accountable to democratic values.
It sounds like a constant balancing act. It makes me think about another one of Huntington's ideas, the military as a profession,
Yeah.
almost like a society apart. And, to illustrate that you picked an image of a Spartan soldier,
I did.
which seems pretty fitting.
Yeah.
So Huntington argues that the military isn't just another job.
It's a unique profession with its own specialized knowledge, skills, values, and culture.
Exactly.
And the Spartans kind of embody that perfectly.
Yeah.
Their entire society was structured around military effectiveness,
Exactly.
right? They were legendary for their intense training and warrior ethos.
Yeah, and I think you even have a quote here from The Soldier in the State,
Yeah.
where he compares the military to other professions like medicine and law.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
And he points out that all of these professions require extensive training, a strong sense of service, and adherence to a specific code of ethics.
Right.
But what makes the military even more distinct is that it deals with the ultimate responsibility,
Okay.
the use of force.
And the Spartans definitely understood that. They were warriors first and citizens second. But that level of dedication to military life,
Yeah.
it had its downsides too, didn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Like Spartan society wasn't exactly known for its individual freedoms or
Yeah.
artistic expression.
Yeah, not so much. So it kind of raises the question of whether Huntington's idea of the military as a society apart
Yeah.
is still relevant today.
It's a good question.
I mean, you've got some notes here where you're wrestling with this.
I am. I think it's a really interesting question
Yeah.
because, think about it. Modern militaries are much more diverse than they used to be.
Okay.
Technology plays a huge role, and soldiers are way more integrated into civilian life than they were in the past.
Right.
But at the same time, the military's core mission, the willingness to use force that still requires a certain mindset and training that sets it apart.
Yeah.
So I think there's still aspects of military culture, the language, the customs, the way decisions are made
Right.
that are distinct from civilian society.
Okay.
So maybe it's less about being a society apart and more about recognizing that the military is a unique and vital profession within society.
A profession that, like you said earlier,
Yeah,
needs to be carefully managed to ensure that it serves its purpose without undermining democratic values.
precisely.
And that kind of leads us to another key challenge,
Okay.
which is finding the right balance between civilian control and military professionalism.
Right.
To illustrate that, you've included this image of a modern soldier, and I think it perfectly captures the complexity we're talking about, because think about it. Technology has transformed warfare.
It has.
We've got drones, cyber warfare, artificial intelligence. How do you even maintain civilian control over something that's constantly evolving and requires such specialized knowledge?
It's a huge question, and it's one that's becoming increasingly urgent. So you need civilian leaders who understand these new domains of warfare, who can ask the right questions,
Okay.
and who can provide effective oversight. But you also need military leaders who are experts in their fields,
Sure.
who are comfortable with these new technologies, and who understand the importance of civilian control and democratic values.
It sounds like the lines are blurring a bit, which makes that balance even harder to find. And to make things even more complicated, you pointed out that all of this is happening in a world with evolving threats.
Right.
Terrorism, hybrid warfare, the spread of misinformation. These are challenges that Huntington couldn't have even foreseen when he was writing in the 1950s.
Absolutely. And, these new threats often don't fit neatly into traditional categories of warfare,
Right.
which can make it difficult to determine how and when to use military force. They raise ethical dilemmas that add another layer of complexity to the whole issue of civil-military relations.
This is a lot to unpack, but I'm really starting to see why understanding these dynamics is so important for anyone who wants to make sense of the world today.
I'm glad to hear that because, like we said at the beginning, this isn't just an academic debate. This has real implications for all of us.
Okay, so we've talked about objective versus subjective control, the military as a distinct profession, and the challenges of finding the right balance in a world of evolving threats. Where do we go from here? What are some of the key takeaways that we should keep in mind as we continue this deep dive?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that civil-military relations are dynamic
Okay.
and constantly evolving.
Makes sense.
What worked in the past might not work in the future.
Yeah.
And we need to be adaptable and willing to rethink our assumptions. Second, I think it's important to remember that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Okay.
The ideal balance between civilian control and military professionalism will vary depending on a country's history,
Right.
culture, and political system.
So what works for one country might not work for another.
Exactly.
Got it.
And finally, I think it's crucial to recognize that this is an ongoing conversation.
Okay.
We need to be constantly asking questions, challenging assumptions,
Yeah.
and debating the best way to manage this complex relationship.
That sounds like a call to action.
It is.
And speaking of action, I've been thinking about something you mentioned earlier. The potential dangers of the military becoming too powerful. In intervening in politics, you know what Huntington called Praetorianism?
Right.
It seems like a pretty serious risk, especially in a democracy.
It is a serious risk.
Yeah.
And it highlights why it's so important to have strong civilian institutions that can provide oversight and accountability for the military.
Yeah.
We need a system of checks and balances to ensure that no one branch of government, including the military, becomes too powerful.
And we need citizens who are informed and engaged in these debates.
Absolutely.
Because ultimately, it's up to us to hold our leaders accountable and to ensure that the military remains a tool for protecting our freedoms, not a threat to them.
Well said. I couldn't agree more.
And I think that's a perfect segue to the next part of our conversation,
Okay.
where we'll delve deeper into some of the historical examples of Praetorianism and explore how this concept is playing out in the 21st century.
It sounds good.
This is getting really interesting.
Yeah, it is.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so we're about to dive into some historical examples of Praetorianism, where the military gets a little too big for its britches
Yeah.
and starts meddling in politics. I'm ready for some juicy historical drama.
Well, you've come to the right place. History is full of cautionary tales
Yeah.
about what can happen when the balance between military power and civilian authority gets out of whack.
Give us the highlights. Where should we start?
Let's go back to ancient Rome,
Okay.
since we were just talking about their army. The Roman Republic, believe it or not,
Yeah.
actually had some pretty strong mechanisms in place to prevent Praetorianism.
Okay.
They had this system where military commands were divided and rotated frequently
Okay.
to prevent any one general from accumulating too much power.
Smart move. They clearly knew how to learn from their mistakes.
They did, but as the Republic expanded and faced more and more complex challenges,
Yeah.
things started to change.
Yeah.
Generals like Julius Caesar
Oh, yeah.
gained enormous popularity and influence through their military victories, which allowed them to challenge the authority of the Senate.
And Caesar, well, let's just say he wasn't exactly known for his humility
No, he was not.
or his respect for civilian authority.
Definitely not. His rise to power and the subsequent civil wars
Yeah.
marked a turning point. The Roman Republic gave way to the Roman Empire.
Right.
And with that shift, the military became increasingly intertwined with politics.
Okay.
The Praetorian Guard,
Yeah.
originally created to protect the emperor,
Right.
ultimately became a kingmaker,
Oh, wow.
wielding immense power,
Yeah.
and often deciding who would rule.
So from protectors to power brokers.
Exactly.
That's a pretty dramatic shift.
It is.
And it seems like this whole idea of Praetorianism wasn't just a Roman problem, right?
Right. We see similar patterns throughout history. Like in medieval Japan, the samurai class gradually gained more and more power,
Okay.
eventually establishing a military government known as the shogunate
Right.
that overshadowed the
Okay.
emperor.
You even have some notes here about more recent examples like Latin America in the 20th century.
Yes, many Latin American countries experienced periods of military rule during the Cold War,
Okay.
where generals seized power, often with the justification of restoring order or fighting communism.
Right.
And these military regimes, they frequently suppressed dissent,
Yeah.
violated human rights, and further destabilized the very societies they claimed to be saving.
Wow. Those are some sobering examples.
Yeah.
It seems like there's a recurring theme here.
Yeah.
Whenever you have a weak civilian government, a powerful military, and some kind of crisis or perceived threat,
Right.
the conditions are ripe for Praetorianism to take root.
That's a great observation.
Yeah.
And it highlights why it's so important for democracies to have robust civilian institutions, a clear legal framework for the use of military force,
Okay.
and a culture that values civilian control.
Makes sense, but all of these examples that we've been talking about are from the past.
Right.
How does Praetorianism manifest itself in the 21st century?
That's a great question, and it's one that scholars and policymakers are grappling with today.
Yeah.
While we don't see outright military coups in established democracies as often anymore,
Okay.
there are still subtle, and sometimes not so subtle ways that the military can exert undue influence in politics.
Okay, I'm all ears. Give me some examples.
Well, one way is through the revolving door
Okay.
between the military and the defense industry.
Mm.
When high-ranking military officers retire,
Yeah.
and then they take up lucrative positions in defense companies,
Right.
it can create potential conflicts of interest
Okay.
and blur the lines between military priorities and corporate profits.
So there's this whole lobbying aspect to it. That makes sense.
Exactly. Another potential area of concern is the growing reliance on private military contractors.
Okay.
These are essentially private companies
Okay.
that provide military-related services.
Like those security firms you see protecting embassies or operating in conflict zones.
Exactly.
Okay.
And while there can be legitimate reasons for using contractors,
Yeah.
the increased privatization of military functions raises questions
Yeah.
about accountability and oversight.
Right.
Who's really in control
Yeah.
when private companies are carrying out tasks that were traditionally the domain of the military?
That's a really interesting point. It seems like the lines are getting blurrier in so many ways.
They are.
And you've got some notes here about how the rise of technology and the changing nature of warfare are also adding new dimensions to this whole debate about Praetorianism.
Absolutely. The growing importance of Cyber warfare, for example, creates a whole new set of challenges for civilian control.
Okay.
Cyber operations, they often require speed and secrecy,
Right.
which can make it difficult for civilian leaders to provide effective oversight
Yeah.
or to fully understand the risks and consequences of these operations.
It's like a whole new battleground that most civilian leaders aren't equipped to navigate.
Exactly. And then there's the issue of artificial intelligence and autonomous weapons systems
Right.
as these technologies become more sophisticated.
Yeah.
We're going to have to grapple with some really difficult questions about who makes decisions about the use of force,
Okay.
how much autonomy we're willing to give to machines,
Right.
and how we ensure that these weapons are used ethically and responsibly.
It feels like we're entering a whole new era of warfare,
It does.
and the old rules might not apply anymore.
Yeah, how do we even begin to think about civilian control in a world where algorithms are making life or death decisions on the battlefield?
Hmm.
It's a question that's going to require a lot of careful thought and debate.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that civilian leaders are educated about these new technologies,
Okay.
that they're involved in setting policies for their use,
Right.
and that there are clear lines of accountability for when things go wrong.
Because things will go wrong. Right.
Of course, no technology is perfect.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important to have these conversations now.
Right.
Before these technologies become even more widespread and powerful, we need to be proactive, not reactive.
So we've talked about the historical roots of Praetorianism.
We have.
How it's manifesting itself in the 21st century.
Hmm.
But what can we do about it? How can we ensure that the military remains a tool for good, a force for protecting our freedoms,
Yeah.
not a threat to them?
Well, like we've been discussing, the first step is awareness.
Okay.
We need citizens who understand the importance of civilian control,
Right.
who are informed about the issues,
Yeah.
and who are willing to hold their leaders accountable.
Education is key, and not just for citizens,
Right.
but for military leaders as well, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Military education should emphasize the importance of democratic values, the rule of law, and the principle of civilian control.
Okay.
Officers need to understand their role in a democratic society and the importance of staying out of partisan politics.
And it's not just about education.
Right.
We also need strong institutions, Brian.
You're exactly right.
Yeah.
We need a robust system of checks and balances that ensures no single individual or institution, including the military, can accumulate too much power.
Right.
This includes things like legislative oversight, judicial review,
Yeah.
and a free and independent press that can hold those in power accountable.
And a culture that values and respects civilian control.
Yes.
It can't just be something that's written down on paper. It has to be something that's ingrained in the fabric of society.
I agree. We need to foster a climate where it's considered unacceptable for the military to overstep its bounds
Yeah.
or to interfere in the political process.
It sounds like there's a lot of work to be done, but I'm feeling more hopeful after this conversation. At least we're starting to ask the right questions.
I agree. The more we understand the challenges,
Yeah.
the better equipped we'll be to address them. And I think that's a good note to end on as we move into the final part of our deep dive.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in our deep dive into civil-military relations. We've explored Huntington's ideas, looked at historical examples of Praetorianism, and considered the challenges of maintaining the right balance in the 21st century.
Yeah, we have.
It's been pretty eye-opening, to be honest.
It's a fascinating topic.
And I think you've really driven that point home with all the examples we've discussed, from ancient Rome to modern-day concerns about cyber warfare and AI. It's clear that this is something we need to be paying attention to, not just leaving it to the experts.
It really is. I mean, this relationship between the military and civilian society, it impacts all of our lives.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned the importance of education a few times now. What would a more robust and effective approach to educating both civilians and military leaders about civil-military relations look like?
Well, for civilians, I think it starts with incorporating these concepts into our education system, and earlier than we do now.
Okay.
Not just in college-level political science courses, but even in high school. We need to help young people understand the basic principles of democratic governance, the role of the military in a free society, and the potential risks of unchecked military power.
So a more proactive approach, rather than waiting for a crisis to happen before we start having these conversations.
Exactly. And for military leaders, I think it's crucial that professional military education emphasizes not just technical skills and strategic thinking,
Right.
but also ethical decision-making, the importance of civilian oversight, and the dangers of politicization.
We've seen throughout history, and even in some current events, how things can go wrong when military leaders start to see themselves as above civilian authority,
Oh, absolutely.
or when they allow their personal political beliefs to influence their actions.
It's a slippery slope.
And I think it's also important to foster a culture within the military that values critical thinking, encourages open dialogue, and rewards those who speak up when they see something that's not right.
Couldn't agree more.
So it's not just about blind obedience.
No.
It's about having a strong moral compass and the courage to do the right thing, even when it's difficult.
I think that's well said.
And that goes for civilians, too. We need citizens who are willing to speak out against the misuse of military power, who are willing to challenge those in authority, and who are willing to defend the democratic principles that underpin a healthy civil-military relationship.
It really is about shared responsibility, isn't it?
Yeah, both civilians and the military have a role to play in ensuring that this relationship remains balanced and productive.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
It's about building trust, fostering mutual respect, and working together to safeguard the values and institutions that make a democracy strong and resilient.
Okay, so we've talked about the need for education, strong institutions, and a culture that values civilian control. Any final thoughts for our listeners as they continue to ponder these complex issues? What's the one thing you really want them to take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway is this. Civil-military relations are not something that we can afford to take for granted.
Okay.
They require constant attention, open dialogue, and a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances.
And to remember that this isn't just some theoretical debate.
Well,
The way we manage this relationship has real-world consequences
right.
for our security, our freedoms, and the kind of society we want to live in.
Well said. So
Mhm.
stay informed, stay engaged, and don't be afraid to ask the tough questions.
Great advice. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the fascinating world of civil-military relations. Thanks for joining us.